Welcome to Let's Talk Death, conversations to inform and inspire. Let's Talk Death is a series of conversations with some amazing people from various fields. Our goal through these conversations is to normalize, educate, and demystify the taboo around death, dying, and the journey of grief. Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we are thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network created for community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Reid Peterson. Reid achieved a master's degree in transpersonal psychology at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in 2007. He was later trained by Dr. Alan Wolfelt from the Center for Loss and Life Transition. Reid's approach utilizes Dr. Wolfelt's companioning philosophy, emphasizing presence, nurture, spirituality, and heart-centered care for the bereaved. Reid is the voice of Grief Refuge, narrating podcast episodes and the Daily Refuge on the Grief Refuge app. Reid is also the facilitator of the Grief Refuge experiences. Reid, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank you for a great opportunity to have a wonderful conversation about death, dying, and grief.
Thank you. So, Reid, before we get into your work, may I ask, did you have a personal death loss experience that kind of led your path to your career?
Yeah, in our short time together, I'm almost baffled as far as which one do I start with. But unfortunately, 5 years ago, I just celebrated irony. I just experienced a 5-year anniversary of the loss of my stepfather, Warren, who was probably the most prominent father figure in my life. My biological father was involved, but he didn't necessarily raise me like my mom and my stepfather did. And so when he passed, he battled cancer for 8 years. And when he passed, I was actually very surprised about the amount of grief I experienced and how lonely the process felt for me. The reason I was surprised was because 10 years prior was when I lost my father, and I grieved that experience. But I would call losing my father, there was a lot of prolonged grief, delayed grief. And after Warren, my stepfather, passed, I started noticing so much more come up for my dad. So my story is complex, but that's just a snippet of some of what got me into really delving into my own grief experience and realizing that there's a lot in this world that could be provided for value to people that are grieving.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Hearing you say that, it is interesting. There is a lot that can be provided. And because everyone's so unique in their experience of grief and just even their own personalities, the same things don't necessarily work for everyone, right? So I think having that variety, it's interesting that you bring that up, having a variety of ways that people can either connect or get support or feel, like you said, you felt like you're all alone, or feel like you're not alone in this. Technology has given us great ways to do that too.
It has, yeah. Heal Grief has done a wonderful job with that.
Thank you. And I want to hear more about the work you're doing. So you have a couple of things going on. First, let's even go back a little further. You trained with Alan. Can you talk to us more about that experience and your takeaways from that?
Sure. Well, as I was grieving, I realized that, first, let me just backtrack a little bit. In my own grieving process, I did seek out the help of community support through hospice with groups, bereavement support groups. And I also did speak with a counselor, and those experiences were fantastic. But it did, I live in Santa Barbara, and I have I'm fortunate to be able to take ocean walks. Yes, I know I'm privileged in that regard. But I found myself almost on a daily basis when grief was hitting me really hard to just go for long ocean walks and realize, and this is, Andy, what you're kind of speaking to in regards to the variety. This is where I recognize, like, wow, loneliness is such a true experience in the grieving process. So as I evolved and I worked through some of this difficulty of my emotional experience, I started feeling a calling. I started feeling that calling to provide support to others and perhaps my creative way. And that led me to Alan's trainings at the Center for Loss and Life Transition. And the experience has been phenomenal. I've learned so much about compassion, and I've learned so much about listening, keeping my eyes soft, my ears open, my heart open, and my mouth closed.
Yes.
So I just have nothing but great things to say about the trainings there.
Alan is a gem to our field and the work that he's done. When you talk about keeping your mouth shut when you're the person facilitating a discussion with people, I always remember the phrase that was taught to me years ago. It's called WAIT, WAIT. Why am I talking? I was told, say that to yourself, and you might listen more.
That's a wonderful acronym.
So you took your experience and your work and you created the podcast first or the app first? Which came first and what are you doing?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that, Fran, because the podcast actually started when the pandemic hit. And I'll just be very transparent. I had a grand vision of opening a grief retreat center, likely somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, I think. And then COVID came. And I was like, wow, I would have to sit on this likely maybe 4 years, if I'm going to be honest with myself. And I just didn't want to shelf like what felt like was coming from my heart, to provide support. And so I started podcasting. And then through podcasting, people started giving me feedback. Oh, Reid, your voice is very calming. Maybe you should be on the Grief app, or not Grief app, Calm app. And then I was like, okay, let me see if I can contact them. And I actually did. And Calm was very responsive and receptive to my idea. However, it just didn't fit with their business model. That's how I kind of perceived, their feedback. And so a dear friend of mine, a very successful life coach, by the way, had said, Reid, you can probably do better. And I said, Jennifer, what do you mean by that? And she said, you should build your own app. And so I was like, let me look into that. And so that's how Grief Refuge was born.
And now tell us about Grief Refuge app.
Sure. I know that, Andy, in your introduction, there was a lot of times the word refuge was said. And I was like, wow, okay, maybe I should shorten that down a bit. But the Grief Refuge app, it's an app on Android and iPhone. And it's free to download. There are some paid features of it. And the essence of it is to be this companion on the grief journey. So every day there's an audio musing that gets published. And then listeners, they're asked to be with it. They're asked to reflect upon their own experience. And sometimes the musing is very educational. Sometimes it's very reflective. Sometimes it's spiritual. Honestly, I write them, and when they get created, it's really what is inspired by me. There's actually been musings that have been created that I've seen from Heal Grief, other Let's Talk Death interviews, other Heal Grief. I'm on the email list, of course. So sometimes I just get inspired by what comes to me, and then also some of the feedback from the people I communicate who are currently pained by their own grief.
So let me ask you this. In the creation of this and response to it and those types of things, just even in the process, I know you already named one surprise, which was originally, again, you were thinking about like a retreat center for grief. But once you got involved in the app and the things that you're doing, is there anything that just surprised you that you didn't know going in you felt the calling, but you found yourself doing this. Are there any things that just surprised you in that process, or maybe were most inspiring to you as you?
Well, I love the question, and it actually makes me go deep inside myself. One, what surprised me is when the idea of the app came about, I was like, I'm taking a very unique approach to an app in grief support. And let me explain that, because actively moving forward is really about connecting people. And I wanted to focus on the inward experience for a griever. And so what surprised me, Andy, and answer your question was, how can this app support someone when I don't know their story? Because they're downloading the app and I have no idea who they are. And so what surprised me is the content has been relatable and familiar enough for grievers to appreciate it and also feel like their own grief experience is seen and heard. So that I actually thank my divine source for. I hold gratitude for that, but that has surprised me more than anything, that it's been well received that way.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, that when people read something that validates their experience, that in and of itself becomes healing for them. And so obviously, whatever you're putting in the app speaks truth to people's experience, and that's really priceless for people. Particularly, you think about this last year with COVID and people just being isolated. We already hear. I mean, I know you hear this, Fran, same thing. People who are grieving, quite often after the first few months, their friends stopped asking. There's no one to talk to about it, and it is a very lonely process. So to have someone validate where you are at that point, even though everyone else has kind of moved along, is I know, because I've heard from people, it stands out, and it definitely speaks to their heart and their need.
So when you say you're the facilitator of the Grief Refuge experiences, is that the daily or the messages that you have, or do you actually facilitate groups?
I have throughout the pandemic. I will be honest, I've had to pause facilitating groups because as I'm sure you know, Fran, in the development of an app, it requires a lot of time, energy, and attention. And so I'm like, well, I can't work 25 hours in a day, so I need to, pick and choose where I invest a lot of my time. So I have paused facilitating support groups online and some of those facilitated events. There was, of course, with Retreat Center as part of a future vision, there was also events scheduled to facilitate retreats for other types of, there was events scheduled to facilitate grief retreats in other locations. That's what I was trying to say. But
So now that the nation seems to be opening up, are you looking at putting that back on track?
yes, but truthfully, more of a long-term vision. The app has been more well received than I actually expected, and so I can just see what I'm noticing too is it's convenient, right? Convenient is an important thing in American culture, and I don't mean that judgmentally at all. It's just it's easy to access. It can be used at any time anyone prefers, and that's important because you never know. Like for a parent who may be grieving, you never know when their child's going to take a nap, and now they can open up their phone and connect with something grief support related for just 8 minutes if they need it. So that's our culture.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Well, Reid, we actually we're coming to the end of our time. I wonder though, before we do, people who listen in quite often want to know how they can connect with our guests, connect with their work. How might people do that want to connect with you and what you're doing?
Well, appreciate you asking. The simplest answer is to visit griefrefuge.com. Pretty much anything that we've talked about is accessible at that website.
And you said that the downloads are free, but that there were fee options?
Yes, yeah. So it's a free download, and then some of the content within the app is free to use for the rest of their life. And there is also some features that require a monthly subscription.
Okay, great. Awesome. Reid, thank you so much for speaking about your work. And we want to thank you for being a guest here on Let's Talk Death and for sharing the inspiration for it.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to those joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
And if you know of a bereaved adult, refer them to the AMF app, where adults of all ages connect with others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure to sign up at healgrief.org to receive our newsletters and links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
So again, with that, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.